So I think today what I'll do is delve a little bit into a more esoteric, or at least niche perspective that a lot of, if not people who are very familiar with Oswald Spengler, at least with people who are familiar with Oswald Spengler, will have been party to and witnessed. So the idea today is that we are transitioning out and away from domination of money towards what is considered, I would say, not I would say, as Spengler has termed, a decaying civilization of blood politics. So every kind of stage of civilization enters this phase where the exhaustion of money in politics occurs. Not to say that money isn't important in politics, is more to say that it's no longer the determinant factor behind being successful in politics, and that can be seen obviously with Julius Caesar being one of the richest men in Rome. So obviously in his rise to power, that was one of the strong factors, but even more so was quite clearly this blood tie and this ability to project his blood politics outwards and to the people and to the masses, more than just buying their favor through bread and coin. And so we are entering this phase, and rightly pinpointed here, as you can probably see in the insert or the outset here, is the formation of caesarism and how that is starting to take effect. And we can see with the rise of Donald Trump and maybe early signs competing with those of, say, Gracchus, the Gracchi brothers in Rome, where there is this push towards reflecting a populist will that goes above and beyond maybe what we would consider classes and just into the feeling and the ethos of the populace. So here I think it's important to probably touch on a lot of these ideas, because if you want to be foreseeing the changes in the political stratum going forward, particularly for the West, it is important to understand the metaphysical changes and the morphology of our political system. So with Trump, it's obviously a lot to do with USA and America and being an American, and the idea that even if you were an American in the 80s with Reagan fighting against communism, that American is somehow a weaker version of what it would be today, from a standpoint of, if you're going to be a flag bearer, it can't just be in opposition to communism. It has to be the idea of the American themselves, and that's not necessarily a explicit us versus them, because during communism obviously there was a lot of worries of internal and spying and things like that from particularly Hollywood and those pinko terms and things like that. But what you see now is very much a I'm more American than you are mentality in America, and Trump obviously harnessing that energy and saying, like, no, the bedrock and the real fundamental pillars of America are these Midwestern gun-toting, freedom-loving Americans. And so pitting that against you call them liberal, but liberal Californians and New Yorkers and such is somewhat parity towards how Rome went through all of those similar changes between the rural and the urban, and the understanding that a soldier who had fought for Rome and then was given land was considered more Roman than potentially a lot of the urbanites who never actually enlisted and never kind of sacrificed themselves into what it meant to be a Roman in that sense. So with that, you can kind of gauge a little bit more of a analogous understanding of what it means to transition into this Caesarian phase, and how strong men with strong wills will be the ones that project themselves politically. You can see a pale imitation of this, of course, in other countries like Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, and then Nigel Farage in the UK, where a lot of emphasis is put on ideas and the way that these men speak to people, and that the messaging and the communication style is almost supreme to the idea, and that fundamentally we want to back someone who's talking in our language, at least, or is authentic and sincere in the way that we want them to be, not what a politician from the old school would have been is more of a perfected and sit down with their PR team for hours and hours trying to refine the way that they communicate a very dull and ambiguous message so as to be as non-radical and as non-extreme as possible. So this fixation now of, no, this is who I am, this is in my blood, and this is how we'll get the things that you want done. And obviously that, and I think the liberals at least have picked up on this implicit threat of violence, because violence is obviously the one transitory factor between politics and war. It's like the politics representing violence, but through opposition in voices in Parliament, in Congress, not necessarily with fists and guns and swords, but the threat of violence and the implicit understanding that violence is one of those tools that politicians and political movements will use is conjured up when you start to hear these strong men and these Caesar types speak, because that is the way that they are going to be able to control and gain power. So I think there is a right to be worried, and in the same sense that that's a natural culmination of how politics in a democracy or something fading as a democracy would happen to transpire. So with that, you have to see that the trend and the wave is turning that way. And so if you're willing to sacrifice and die for causes, you will always be able to win in the end. And so the person willing to accept defeat because they're not willing to die will never be able to, in the extreme, come away with a victory. And now that blood, will actually require sacrifice, whereas money obviously can be spent and you can bankrupt yourself, but there's no necessarily material degradation of your body. Not regarding the soul, but in terms of that. So I think it's also integral for this practical, or the praxis of caesarism is that we have no policy necessarily that's coherent to a Caesar type. It's not that you cannot be more in tune with the people's wants from certain places, say the countryside, where they will be more caring and interested in farming policies, and it's more to do with how do I get the message to the people in a way that they'll want to hear it, and that can be in really nondescript terms like America first, like make America great. These are kind of catch-all terms which you can identify with if you really in your blood feel that you are an American and willing to die for that idea, versus my citizenship and my passport says I'm American, and that legalese is enough for me to justify my existence in the democratic process with certain ideas, which we're finding out is obviously not true. If you're not willing to die for an idea, then you don't really care that much, and if you're not willing to care that much, then all you're going to do is vote, and when voting becomes something that's no longer the hurdle for political gains, then you're kind of you're exhausted all your options, which were fairly perfunctory as they were. So with that, I think the ability for money to influence isn't gone necessarily, and it won't be for 50 years, but it's diminished in terms of you can't necessarily now, particularly with the multifarious media outlets that people are paying attention to, just buy people's thoughts and ideas as much. There's so much fragmentation and dispersion of these thoughts and ideas that you can now see even with the discourse on something as completely alien to an American's day-to-day life as the Israel-Palestine, is that there's still these really strong opinions being able to be conjured on different platforms from demographics you wouldn't necessarily associate to these causes in those ways. So no money in the world can persuade some people to think anything, and that is going to be obviously much more prevalent going forward. So to understand that obviously is to understand how do you capture the attention of everyone in these disparate town halls. How do I go into a platform and make sure that I am being the figurehead and the Caesar and representing these people in a way that they would give their lives for me, because inevitably in the next 100 years that will be the case. There will need to be a shedding of blood again in politics for it to mean anything, because the docility and the pedestrian way that politics has been conducted since World War II is more or less you show up, you vote, nothing changes, and then this degradation and decay of the liberal democracy is kind of pissing everybody off to a certain extent, where it's, you know, if you're infuriated with not being heard and not being seen, eventually, if you have enough inner vim, or, you know, you have some furor teutonicus, there will be some I don't say vengeance, but there will be some boomerang effect in terms of what goes out, in terms of you know, negative energies going to come back in that sense. So I think to turn it towards Spengler is obviously he's identified that these periods just are natural occurrences across the life cycle of a civilization, from culture to civilization, and civilization's slow, you know, ossification and decay, which we can then think, okay, so if we do have 200 years now starting caesarianism, and with this Donald Trump being the, what would you call, the introductory figurehead of the metaphysical movement, the morphology, we can just admire in a sense that we're living in what would be called the golden age of the end age. So this golden period where, you know, great things are actually possible once again. There is a second religiousness, and that if you wanted to see kind of continuation of what it means to be a Faustian man, then living in this day and age you may actually see come to pass some future great things. And if we can think back to Rome, I mean, Caesar himself being somewhat of a student of Alexander, who was renowned for being a descendant of, say, Hercules and an avatar of Zeus. And then we can see with Julius Caesar, obviously his very close resemblance to something like the Roman god of war, like Mars, personified, you know, incarnate there, smashing the Gauls, coming back and taking over the entire empire, because the power he wielded was so supreme. It was the mandate from the gods, and in that sense we can obviously project exactly what will transpire in the different metaphysical realm of the Faustian man, but in the same sort of resemblance. It's a very uncanny image of, you know, even though the clothes are different, the actor is the same. So for us, I think we have to be more reflective on where we've come from to understand what type of Teutonic and Faustian man will rise and be interpreted as the avatar in this sense of Thor, and, you know, maybe of Tyr, in the sense that war and the possibilities that war provides will come. And this is not to degrade the grand notion here with something as piddly as like a Ukrainian separatist war with civil war with Russia, or these are all very minor skirmishes in the grand scheme of the Faustian destiny. These will have no impact short of nuclear weapons. The Faustian realm is still undivided and untouchable, and so with this, our politics remains the pinnacle of politics globally. And from that pinnacle, we have the capstone being the USA. And to understand how the rise of a Caesar is going to happen is to understand the structures that we kind of just work in. And then I think for us, knowing who we are, knowing that post-World War II, we've had this bifurcation of our identity, where one side was the knightly virtues and the other side the Viking soul. What we can say is, now that we're no longer able to recognize any knightly part of our soul because there's no reflection and representation, then the pure Viking instinct has won and won out, and therefore our representation in terms of Caesarism will be that Viking. It will be the ultimate Rollo, you know, the man who's come across the ocean and conquered a unconquerable land. And so from that sort of beginnings can we see the beginning of the end. I think our second religiousness is upon us, and that's clearly identified. I think it's obvious to anyone who understands the Norse paganism transition by the sword to Christianity, and the alienness of Christianity to begin with, when it comes to whether this is a felt and imbued religion or a forced upon religion, and how a Faustian man operates is not under this Christian scope, and this is very clear with the first Protestant the rise amongst from Luther, but then also the Reformation, but then also from the transition away from even Protestantism to atheism, is that because it never felt right and it was forced upon the Germanic tribes via the sword or through very subterfuge policies out of the Eastern Roman Empire, then you do get this sense that once it dissolves in terms of meaning, there has to be a replacement. You can't have a vacuum. So nature abhors vacuums, and our religiousness is the same. We must be possessed by something. So from that, I think it's very clear that we will have to grow into one more very serious, sincere religious experience. And the options are obviously fairly limited in terms of, if it's new, then it has to be something which is bound to the soul and from the heart of the Faustian man, but at the same sense, something that will eventually transform and become like Christianity was for the Romans, and then extended beyond into separate beliefs and religious systems, to say that we now also have to own the fact that Christianity no longer provides the guidance and the tools capable to assuage our feelings and the way that we want to approach the world. The morality of Christianity never really took hold, because if it did, then we would have been in paradise. But you obviously have to take out a lot of those early conversion myths and the idea that Odin and being the All-Father had so much of his identity transported upon Christ and God, just so that the coherence for those Germanic tribes and the Teutonic mindset could be transmitted. It's very clear that obviously that's still that same sense, that Jungian archetype is going to exist perennially, in ad infinitum for our Faustian soul. It is who we are. We are the children of the All-Father, and the descendants of Odin will have to reclaim that title as he wanders back in from the abyss where he was sent by this false idol. So from that, we can really much understand both the tie into how Caesar will rise as an archetype, and both as a reincarnation of what we would consider a mythology tied to legend, and how that actually holistically will more or less mean that we are going to see the Caesar of our time in the next 100 years, and that it will mean there will be this golden age, but it will require, and it will necessitate bloodshed and violence and tumult. So knowing Trump is this presage, then we can kind of set to tackle this in a way that is comforting, but also allows you to be ready. And if you can understand the morphological changes and the way that we're destined to go, then you can at least adapt and potentially influence these things. So I think for me, that's the crux, is to really take away that we have to first understand where we're headed in a trajectory, and using Spengler's very defensible position here on the life cycle of civilizations. And I think reflexively we can admit that he was definitely right in this case, and it's going to be more or less the next 20-30 years the determinant of what type of Caesar we get, and whether you're on the side that is remembered in history as the victor and the winner, right being might being right, versus the Pompey or the losers, we can call them. But to phrase it in the Nietzschean way, the Übermensch and the master will overcome the slave in this era of slave-dominated politics.